I was working the night shift in a remote gas station at the end of a highway. It was the middle of nowhere, and the only other people around were a group of raptors camping up the river. That night, around 1 in the morning, I was doing my bathroom weekly wipe down, and I stood in the middle of the bathroom and began to smell a very strange odor. It startled me. I kind of smelled it for just a minute and realized it was like that of rotting death or meat. So I looked up in search of the smell, but found nothing immediately. After stepping outside briefly, I looked around for any possible source, but I couldn't trace any. Then, just above me, I hear this whooshing sound, like something large flying directly overhead. I turn to look, and I see this dark black silhouette, shaped kind of like a giant bird or something, fly right overhead and fly right over the gas station. I'm thinking to myself, what did I just see? And I'm kind of stunned there in the moment, trying to process, is there some sort of giant owl or bird that flies around at night? Then it comes back again, this time flying over the gas station in the opposite direction. And this time, there was no mistaking what I saw. Attached to this thing were these two glowing red eyes as it flew directly overhead. Safe to say, I was terrified. As the only really attendant there, I ran back inside and hid. Because we're more of a rural gas station, really after about 10 or 11 p.m., our traffic flow really dies down. So I ran inside, locked the doors, and waited for maybe about 45 minutes before feeling safe enough to unlock them. I never saw really what it was close up, and whatever it was never flew down close enough for me to accurately see it. The rest of my shift would go on as pretty normal, and when I got off work the following day, I told a couple of my close friends what just happened. I'm not ashamed of it. I was outright open. They were actually pretty understanding and told me that, they said, man, it sounds like you had yourself a Mothman encounter. And I said, a what? And they're like, yeah, a Mothman. It's this demon owl cryptid that generally hangs around the West Virginia area. But it sounds like you had your own dose. Well, first off, I'm new to the whole concept of what a cryptid is, or creature, or being, whatever it is you call them. So, my good friend kindly redirected me right at you and told me, this guy right here, email him. He can help you get some answers and clarity. So, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I'm wanting to ask you myself, did I see a Mothman? Or was this something else entirely? Maybe this was just a giant owl, and somehow the lights from the gas station caused its eyes to glow red. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of any rational explanation, because the logical thought of a Mothman actually coming near here, I don't know. It's just hard for me to process. Thank you for your time. This happened last summer, July of 2020. I have a pretty nice little house out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, it's a ways out in the countryside, but you know what? I enjoy it. So, one night, I'm sitting out on my porch, just enjoying the beautiful serenity that the night brings, smoking a cigarette. I'm lost in thought, thinking about whatever it was I was thinking about, and all of a sudden, I hear this giant thud, like something really heavy landed on the roof to my tiny house. Immediately, I shoot up and I'm looking around, and then, not even a few seconds later, I hear more thudding, as if whatever it was on my roof was now walking around. Now, I jump down off my porch to turn around and try to get a look at what had fallen on my roof. I turn, and to my horror, this being or thing was standing on my roof, looking at me. I'll do my best I can to describe it to you. It was a tall black silhouette with what appeared to be large bat wings or something, but they were kind of folded in. The body was a very weird shape. It was kind of human-esque, but it wasn't really like a head and body. It was just a body, if that makes sense. And it had two glowing red eyes, kind of tucked in between the wings, and it was staring at me. It wasn't a full moon out, so the visibility wasn't exactly the best. But as soon as I saw this thing, I dropped my cigarette. And for that split second in time, I had somehow managed to convince myself this is just a dream, you're hallucinating it, you need to go inside. But then, before I could even finish that trail of thought, this thing opens its wings and shoots off into the night sky, disappearing completely. Safe to say, I ran inside, locking my door, not going out for the remainder of the night. The next morning, I get up and go out there, and, of course, this thing was nowhere to be found. No traces of it, nothing. I mean, I guess with the events that transpired, I didn't really expect there to be any evidence or traces, but I don't know. Maybe in the moment, I just felt like observing my surroundings would hopefully give me some sort of closure. That maybe it was just a dream, maybe I just hallucinated it. So, I decided to take my encounter to the internet. I tried to do some researching and see what I could not find. Well, unfortunately, what I experienced was not a hallucination. Turns out, what I think I saw is something called the Mothman, originating from Point Pleasant. I had no idea this thing was even a thing, or it even existed. I don't know if it's a being, or a demon, or some sort of animal, but whatever it was, it terrified me, and I haven't seen it since, and I don't ever want to see it again. This isn't my story. It's actually a family friend's, so I'll change the names, just to keep their identity safe. Basically, a group of these teenagers were on a camping trip when they were attacked by this winged being, or a supernatural force, and they were basically forced to find the way to escape. My friend, or my father's friend, Kenny, was always the adventurous type, and wanted his kids to experience the great outdoors and all it had to offer. So, his son and his friends were convinced that they can handle doing a little camping and hiking, even if it bled into the night. Well, they were wrong. They had barely been on the trail for a day when strange things had begun to happen. First off, it wasn't too long into the trip when they all picked up on the feeling they were being followed by something. They couldn't tell what. It was just some sort of presence. Then, they hear the sound of twigs snapping and things like that. Something large in the trees watching them very closely. As a matter of fact, before even nightfall began, one of the kids thought they saw a strange, shadowy creature. And before they knew it, they were convinced they were being hunted. They turned to see a dark figure flying through the trees, sitting on one of the high-end branches. And it appeared to have red eyes, watching them, keeping track of their every movement. It appeared to be getting closer and closer each time, and they all felt it was going to attack them. Somehow, the kids managed to make a little makeshift campsite. They were planning on roughing it out through the night, and after a while, they looked at each other in confusion and wondered, why are they trying to do this? They should leave. They were also wondering if this was just some collective nightmare, and they needed to be more careful. They decided, we need to leave and get out of here. That night, this thing came into their campsite. That night, this thing pretty much enters their camp before they get a chance to disassemble, scaring them all to death. I guess it had tried attacking one of the kids, trying to grab them with its talons and pick them up. They all fled, screaming, leaving their couple tents and any equipment they had behind. They all grabbed whatever gear they could and ran as fast as they could in unison. And just when they thought they were safe, this dark figure was following them. They finally found a place to hide, but they had to keep moving. They had to find their way out of the woods. They finally saw a light and realized it appeared to be a cabin close by the road, and they ran as fast as they could. This thing was now pursuing them through the trees, chasing them, They were in a portion of woods that had a lot of thick fir trees, so movement was kind of limited. They said they could hear this thing jumping through the trees, watching them, coming after them, like it wasn't trying to come down and swoop at them, but just keep track of them, like it was waiting. The kids kept looking behind them and saw that this thing was getting closer and closer, as if it was leading them to trap them. So, after a few hours of this going on, the kids had lost hope, but managed, even though they were exhausted, tired, and hungry, managed to make it to some back road they didn't know existed, just in the nick of time to hear somebody driving by. It was a lone trucker, and they knew that was the sound they had been waiting for. It was the sound of an approaching truck. They waved the trucker down, and he managed to be able to pull over and help these poor kids out. They were now freed, and their father came and gave them all a ride. This was back in 1977, and they still don't really talk about the experience. They don't know what followed them. They're all convinced it was some sort of creature. I thought the story is an interesting one, since I've been told it for a long time, and it's part of my family friend story. So I wanted to find out for them. You seem to know a lot about monsters and creatures. What do you think it was? Please, read this story in its entirety. The events are chronological to the best of my ability, and the reason I am posting this is because I think people who will read it will find this absolutely fascinating. I'm not a believer, but I am a hearer of the strange. I've spent a lot of time in Western Virginia and have been to every major area of sightings. I am familiar with the lore, but never have been able to come across any real information. I am posting this because it may be of value to somebody. I have nothing to gain by posting this, and there is no intention or intention to try to cash in on the situation. I just feel that this is one of the most fascinating things I could have ever had happen, and I hope somebody else out there feels the same. I want to share this. So, this has been hard to type. It's been amazing but very emotional for me, and I want to do my best to recreate the events as they occurred. I will try to post this story verbatim as best I can. This happened on the night of Friday, January 16th, 2015. It was a very cold and windy night, and I was about to head to bed. I was on my couch with my wife and my dog, and we were watching a movie. About 10:30 or 11 p.m. rolls around, and I tell my wife I'm going to bed. I am a big-time insomniac, so I don't go to bed that early. I was looking out my living room window, and there was a big snowstorm coming in. The wind was whipping, and you could see the snow being blown by the wind. The temperature was below freezing. I closed the curtains and headed to my bedroom. As I'm walking down the hall, I hear a thumping noise coming from my back door, followed by a whistling noise. I went to the door, opening it up, and immediately see this thing just outside my door, maybe 25 to 30 feet away from it, and it was night, so I couldn't make out every detail, but I could see it was kind of a grayish dark color. It was big, black, and had kind of a pointed beak and very large red eyes. It stood almost upright, but kind of at a slanted angle, and appeared to have what I can describe as wings on its back. It was very large. It was much taller than an average man, although I cannot give you a height estimate. I did not see that it had any ears or other facial details, but I could see that it was breathing and was looking straight at me. Not even 2 seconds later, this thing takes off straight up into the air at a very high rate of speed. As it went up, it makes a whistling sound, and you could see its wings moving really fast. As I see it go up, the moonlight kind of fades. So that's it. I closed my door and I was done. Unsure of what I just saw, I go back and tell my wife, and I say, "Honey, I just saw something up there I can't explain." And she could tell something was wrong. I was ghastly pale. Something was very wrong. I have no way to try and explain away what I saw, and it's honestly a mystery. While part of me wants to believe and accept that this was a Mothman encounter, part of me also wants to believe and accept it was something else entirely. What? I'm not sure. I live in Mason County, West Virginia, in the Mason-Mingo Junction area. I have 2 Mothman sightings in my entire life. The first was in 1992 to 1993. I was roughly 8 or 9 years old, and at this time, it was evening, and I was just getting out of the shower. Because of where our shower was in the house, I had to go and use my parents' shower. Theirs was really the only operable one at the time. So I'm getting out of the shower, getting dressed in my parents' bedroom. When out the window, I see this figure land and dart into this tree. The movement just naturally catches my attention, and I walk over the window to go and look. Standing, perched on top of this tree, is what I thought was a large bat at first, but the more I looked, even at that age, I just knew it wasn't right. Something was so wrong about it. The way it looked, the way it moved just seemed unnatural. The way it furled its wings inward. Then, it immediately looked over in my direction, as if it knew I was watching it. I remember kind of just gasping and stepping back. This thing immediately darts down to the ground and kind of vanishes into a small sect of trees. Completely startled by this, I get dressed fully, go downstairs, and tell my mom what I just saw. She, of course, being a mom, simply dismisses any claims I would have had and just says, "Oh, honey, you probably saw an owl or a bird. Nothing to be alarmed of." But I wasn't buying her explanation. Even though I was 8 or 9, I wasn't stupid. I knew what an owl or bird looked like, and my mom trying to cheaply explain it away wasn't doing it justice. So, a couple of days later, I was very close with my grandfather at the time, so I brought my encounter story to him. He believed me. Oh yes. As a matter of fact, he's seen the Mothman too, multiple times, even going as far back as being a young boy before the infamous grouping of sightings back in the 60s. He tells me that these things, that there's not just one of them, but there's several of them. They hang around the area and they mainly stay in the woods, and to mainly try and just stay out of the woods at night if you can. But I told him I wasn't in the woods, I was in the house. And he responded by telling me that even though I wasn't in the woods when this happened, we're close by, and to just try my best to stay away from not only wooded areas, but any areas around wooded areas, just to try and stay safe. There's no telling what these things are capable of, and if anything, they're probably extremely dangerous. Alright, now let me tell you a bit about my second encounter. For this one, we fast forward in time about 10 or so years. I was now 19 years old and had a part-time job working at a lumber mill. Because of where we lived at the time, we were a little bit ways out of town, and this lumber mill was roughly 6 miles away from my house. To get there, you had to take a lot of back roads, which meant coming back at night, I had to be very cautious of deer. I mean, the area was full of black-tailed deer, constantly having times where they'd jump out in front of your car. So, naturally, it being nighttime, and with that in mind, I was always on very high alert. So I'm driving home, it's dark, it's maybe sometime in the spring or fall. I can't remember which, but it was roughly 7 or 8 p.m. Like I said, it was dark, and I'm driving these roads, and I come to a fork in the road. I make a right turn to lead back to my house. Now, I'm maybe 3 miles away, and as I'm coming down the straight road, this figure I see is standing right in the middle of the road. And as I'm pulling up to it, I'm thinking to myself, who's standing in the road? But things begin to get a little bit more unnerving. The closer I get, the more closer my headlights start to illuminate this figure. And like normal, if it was a person, the headlights would start to reveal details of the person. You know, like what they looked like, their clothing, etc. The only problem here is, the more the lights hit this thing, nothing showed. It was just pitch black, like there were no details at all, as if it was some formulated physical cloud of black smoke, is how I can best describe it. So I'm getting closer and closer to this thing and just trying to rationalize and make out what I'm looking at. You know, I couldn't tell you the exact second that my brain just had that aha moment, where it clicked that I had seen enough of this thing to fully have that flashback memory of the same thing I saw 10 years prior, and immediately, that recognition was horrific. This thing opened its wings, revealing the same two eyes that I saw when I was 8 or 9, and I knew instantly, this is the same creature. I want to say I thought about it and made a very intelligent reaction, but what I recall is my body just reacting to the sighting, and I slam on my brakes, no more than 50 feet away from this thing, contesting my driving further down the road. And without even thinking the thought, I throw my car into reverse, do a quick 180, and I'm zooming in the opposite direction, not even caring to check my rearview mirrors. In that moment in time, my only motive was to make as much distance between me and this thing as possible. Yeah, I took the long way home, which took an extra 20-25 minutes, but it was worth it. I never did tell my mother or my grandfather at that point what I saw. Not this point. Now, fast forward another few years, and I'm about 23. I'd finally saved up enough money to move out on my own and away and out of town. Well, since then, I've had a budding career, and fortunately for me, I have had 0 encounters, sightings, or experiences with this, what people I guess call the Mothman. But they do at least make interesting stories now that I've made peace with them. So I'm happy to share them with you. Use them as freely as you want. Just please, keep my name out of this. Thanks. Hello. I am a private detective in Denton, Texas. I have a sighting I would like to share with you that took place back in August of 1999. I was sent to a residence in Denton County to do an investigation for a child custody case. I was sent there to do a check on the welfare of a person who was supposed to be living in the residence. I arrived at about 7 p.m. and went inside to make my investigation. While in the residence, I was startled by a noise coming from the back. I went to the back and found a 5-foot-tall creature with glowing red eyes in the backyard, and I observed as this thing climbed up a pine tree and flew off with what appeared to be large bat-like wings. It moved very fast and very gracefully, kind of like it just glided across the sky. It was incredibly unusual. Of course, I reached out to local law enforcement, but they said they get these reports more often than not, and there's nothing they could do. I'm not really the one to share and talk about paranormal sightings and happenings, but I have been a fan of your channel for a while now, and I figured that you might enjoy this little nugget. I've never really understood what it was, or why it was there, or what its purpose was. All I can say is that I guess I'm a part of the lucky club that actually has had the fortune, or depending on how you look at it, misfortune, of seeing something like this in person. This sighting occurred right around the summer of 2001. I was out in the woods with my boyfriend at the time, camping. It was a wonderful, peaceful night. Very clear. We were just sitting out looking at the stars together. It was about maybe 11 to 11:30 p.m. It was now getting pretty late. I had just finished telling my boyfriend that I was tired and was ready to check in for bed in the tent, when I noticed something moving quickly through the trees. I looked to my left and saw a being. Now, I don't know what it is, and I don't claim to know what it was, but I've never seen anything like it before. It was maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and had red eyes. I could not tell if it had wings or not, but it moved extremely fast and was very agile. I just remember thinking to myself, what is that? Could it be a bear? It had very long arms and was running on 2 legs. It ran by us so fast that I couldn't make out details on the face, but I can tell you, judging by its stature, size, the way it moved, it was impossible for it to be a human. I mean, it was so dark out there. Why would anybody be doing this? We were startled. At least I was. I told my boyfriend what I saw, and to come find out, he saw the same thing too. He just didn't want to say anything to me to scare me. He said he saw the same thing and that it was very fast, but like he could only make out a faint silhouette. That was more than enough for him. I am 100% sure that what I saw was not human. I don't know what it was, and I have never seen a bear move like that before, assuming it is a bear. I've heard of things called a Mothman, but I don't know. It could also, I guess, be a Bigfoot, but I'm not really into Bigfoot or the idea that one exists. In fact, the idea is silly to me, but I clearly can't deny what we experienced on this camping trip. Either way, I don't want to come to any conclusions just yet. I think I'd rather wait for your opinion. You tell me, what do you think I saw? As I was driving back home from work, and as I was almost home, I got off the exit for the street that I live on. As I slowed down at the off-ramp, I see these two huge red eyes catching my attention. I looked at it, and it looked at me. I sped away as quickly as I could. It was bigger than a man, and it had wings. It was black, and it didn't have a head. I usually don't believe the stories that people tell that this thing is the Mothman, but based on what I saw, how could I say no? I'm not sure if I could call myself a believer in Mothman, but I do believe in extraterrestrials. I've seen this with my own eyes, and I know for a fact it was real. The creature did not look like a human being. It did not look like anything that I've seen before. It came soaring out of the sky right at my car, and had I not slowed down, I probably would have hit it. I'll never forget what I saw. I'm kind of still in shock over it, honestly. I know the Mothman is something talked about and seen by so many of the locals, but I never in a million years could have imagined that I myself would see it. I've seen many strange things in my life, but this was the most bizarre thing I have ever seen. I can't explain it, but I know what I saw. I know it was real. It was no dream. I wish it was. I know many others see this thing too, so I know I'm not crazy. I was lying in bed at about 2 a.m. after staying up pretty late. That's when I noticed this very large shadow just outside my window. It immediately caught my attention. I live next to a really large lake out here in the woods, so I wasn't sure what it was. It was much larger than a deer, like I initially thought. I was convinced at first it was a deer, but then I noticed it was standing upright. So I opened my window further to see this huge black creature, which then I noticed it had a very large wingspan, and it was hovering over the lake. This thing looked to be bigger than a human, but its head was shaped kind of like a dome, like a large black moth. I only saw it for a few seconds, but even in the dark and the dim moonlight, I locked right onto it, noticing that it looked all sorts of wrong. This was something not of the natural world. And its eyes. There is something wrong with the eyes. They seemed to illuminate red, glowing this faint light. It was all black, pitch black, and it had long wings. It seemed to kind of sit there for a few seconds and then kind of shoot off in the distance, disappearing between the trees. I was convinced that maybe was this a Bigfoot, although I don't know anything about Bigfoot. Do Bigfoot have wings? Do they even live in the woods? I don't know. I didn't hear any other movement. I didn't smell anything. I didn't notice anything else that was strange. Just that sight. And for the record, from where I'm sitting in bed, if you look out the window, I have a perfect view of the lake, which, mind you, is only maybe 50 feet away from my bedroom. So, if there's any movement out there, I'm gonna see it. And the way the moon was positioned that night, right up in the right spot in the sky, gave me the perfect illumination of this being or object that was just hovering there. Look, I'm like you. I wish I could give you a proper explanation of what it was or what it could have been, but I really don't know. So, I've taken the time to write this encounter up and send it to several people, you, of course, being one of them, and the replies I'm getting back are a little unnerving. I guess somebody had mentioned something about a demon, while somebody else mentioned something about a Mothman. Now, I took the time to do some research before I send you an email, and come to find out, the Mothman is this, what they call a cryptid, and it normally exists in western Virginia, and I guess was even responsible for a ton of disasters around Point Pleasant. And while yeah, the concept is very interesting, I'm just not 100% sure I'm fully convinced yet. Although, I do believe and I know I saw something, but what that something was, I'm not too sure. So, in my search for the answer, I stumbled upon you. You seem to be the kingdom of encounters and stories, and hopefully knowledge that will solve this case. If you can't, well, I'm hoping you'll at least read this and maybe your viewers will be able to crack the case. And maybe, if I'm lucky, you'll put this up online and I can read people's comments. That's if you choose to read this. Anyhow, in closing, I appreciate your efforts and any responses you give. Thank you for your time. Brian here again, and I wanted to dedicate this email to all things Mothman, Mothman sightings and stories. I've not only heard accounts and stories from the Point Pleasant area, but also all over the southeastern section of the United States, even up in Pennsylvania and western New York. I've heard all sorts of horrible stories you wouldn't believe. Many of my most northern accounts are based out of Chicago, which many people have sightings there too, and you wouldn't believe that. I'll be sure to try my best and to share those stories with you. I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy them. The first story I'll share with you is from a married couple whom I spoke to personally. We'll call them Dawn and Stephanie, a married couple in their 40s. They were hiking around in the Wayne National Forest, which is actually just north of Point Pleasant. They said they began to feel uneasy when the wife spotted this dark figure with large wings flying above them, above the tree line. She said at one point it swooped down onto a branch and watched them. Then, they came to some sort of large clearing, and this being, or figure, swooped down at them, scaring them, causing them to flee in horror and for their lives. They fled all the way back to their vehicle, where the thing apparently did not pursue the chase, but seemed intent on hurting them. Both the husband and wife described it as a large mass humanoid shape, with large tethered, tattered wings, kind of like that of a bat. They didn't see any features of the face. It was just like a large black silhouette, but had large red glowing eyes, kind of like bioluminescent orbs. Very, very creepy. They were pretty scarred from the experience, and even sought trauma therapy, in which most therapists actually did not believe them, which caused them to stop therapy altogether. And now, they just deal with their sighting and express it to others, hoping they can help. But there are many around this area in West Virginia that have their own sighting. Going slightly northwest of Point Pleasant is a small town known as Jackson. There is an older gentleman who lives outside of Jackson who had his own horrifying experience. He said he saw one of these things swoop down and grab his dog and carry it off in the trees. Says it happened the same way you would see a hawk swoop down and grab a salmon out of the river. It was just a quick blur of emotion. It grabbed his German Shepherd, and off it went, his dog howling in pain and fright, and this thing was gone. He said it was too quick to be able to go grab his rifle and shoot at it. The man, very distressed during the interview I had with him, had to cut it short. He was visibly too shaken and too frightened. That's an encounter and interview that will always stick with me. That's how I know some of these people are not lying to me. They have nothing to gain from it, and when you're too shaken up to continue the interview and the story, something happened. You can't fake that kind of trauma. I asked him why he never bothered calling the police, and quite frankly, between not believing him and thinking there's nothing they could do, he told me why bother. Heading westward to a small town of Lucasville, just north of Portsmouth, a woman was driving on the main stretch of road at night when she said this Mothman figure dropped down about 30 yards directly in front of her car, making her slam on her brakes. She said to me over the phone that even though her brights were fully illuminating this thing, that it was still like a shadow. No details, just a solid figure of black with 2 glowing red eyes. But here is where the encounter gets terrifying. She said this thing, this demonic being, telepathically spoke to her, telling her it was going to kill her, her entire family, and torture her. In incredible fright, her fight or flight senses kicked in, and she swerved the car around as fast as she could, nearly flipping the car, and drove well over 60 miles in the opposite direction, heading south when she was supposed to be heading north. She booked in at a local motel and had a close family relative come and pick her up, saying she refused to drive that road anymore. Sadly, she passed away January of 2020. Going north a bit, northeast of Columbus, Ohio, is a town called Mount Vernon, where a man in his late 30s, on his morning drive to work, spotted a large black figure flying westward in the sky. Said it was incredibly fast and was far too large to be any bird that he's aware of. Said it looked almost human in shape and was just that, like all the other sightings, a large black silhouette. Moving up north, heading west from Cleveland, you have a very small town called Oak Harbor, where an older man experienced complete and utter terror. Driving during the evening time along Highway 2, he spotted what appeared to be a large black bird of incredible size flying from the northeastern direction, heading southwest from Lake Erie towards him. He said, even though it was flying in that direction, it seemed to be heading directly at him. Frightened, he was already on his way home, but picked up the pace and said it kept level with his car up in the sky and followed him around. He said once he got home, he was so frightened he did not even look up in the sky to see if it was still following him. He ran in his house, locked all of his doors, and a couple of hours later, he tells me he heard something of heavy proportion land on his roof with a heavy thud. The entire night, he could hear something heavy walking around on his roof on 2 legs. Thud, 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 is what he told me he could hear, back and forth, all along his roof. This happened till around 2 or 3 in the morning, when it suddenly stopped. He believes it was whatever this was chasing him. For whatever reason, he's not sure. His stance is it is the dreaded Mothman. A young woman in her early 20s described what she says is the Mothman. It stalked her and hunted her for years. She lived just north of Louisville, Kentucky. She says the first time she ever saw it was after a terrible thunder and lightning storm, and that it has followed her from Indiana all the way down to Kentucky, all throughout her life, popping in randomly just to make sure she knows her place, like it wants her to be suppressed, like it wants her to be terrified. She's expressed to me that every time she goes outside, she can't help but always feel like she has to look over her shoulder or check her surroundings thoroughly, feeling like the Mothman is always going to be there, observing her and watching her. It's almost like her demonic guardian, except the opposite of a guardian, more like an assailant. I'd asked her if she does any sort of religious activity to try and defend herself, like burn sage, talk to a priest, pray, and she firmly stands that she's an atheist and believes if she stands her ground and ignores it enough, it'll just go away on its own. At this point in my email, I want to kind of change the pace of things up. Let's go back down southeast to Charlotte in North Carolina. This is where sightings kind of change up a little bit. So Charlotte is actually pretty south of Point Pleasant. And while people still have sightings, frequent I might add, of what they describe as the Mothman, the descriptions change a little bit. It's not just a large black silhouette that resembles the typical Mothman you'd see all around Point Pleasant, The descriptions are a little bit more bat-like. Like the wings, instead of just being a dark shadow, are more like large, tattered bat wings, and the body is almost large and gargoyle-like, with a tail sometimes, and other times without a tail. But the head is still the same. It's still seen as a general dark figure, with two large glowing red eyes. All the attributes, all the behaviors still line up with all your typical Mothman sightings, which leads me to believe that this is either A, the same cryptid, just taking on a different form, or B, a brother like cryptid to the Mothman, dare I say Batman, or would that just be too out of place and cheesy? I'll let you decide. A young couple in their 20s with a newborn baby described seeing a large bat-like black figure swoop down and steal all 12 of their chickens overnight. It was the most horrifying thing, the man had told me. He even tried shooting at it, but said the bullets didn't seem to do anything to it, and it was adamant about stealing every one of his chickens. The man is very heavily religious, has prayed, and hasn't seen it back since. His firm belief is that this Mothman figure is from hell, and it needs to be rid of through prayer and faith. And here's another really crazy one for you. A man and his brother broke down in a vehicle south of Lynchburg, which is pretty well north of Charlotte. Northeast, actually. Apparently, the younger brother declares that he was possessed by the Mothman, acting completely out of character, doing things and saying things that would almost resemble that of demonic possession. The younger brother claims that he was told to take his own life, and he's going to, quote-unquote, follow the orders of the demons. He then pulled out his gun and shot himself in front of his older brother. Whether it was a mental breakdown or not is a different story. The older brother, only being the older brother by about 4 years, claims he was very close with his younger brother, and his younger brother and entire family never showed signs of any schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. In fact, him and his brother had very good lives, good jobs and careers, great families, everything going for them. And out of the blue, he said his brother immediately began acting different, complete personality change, all in a 24-hour period while they were south of Lynchburg. And his younger brother, before committing suicide, kept claiming he was possessed by the Mothman. The older brother also explained to me that him, his younger brother, and their entire family weren't religious at all. They used to be Catholic when they were little, but since having a falling out with the church when they were little, his parents are agnostic, and they were atheistic and agnostic as well, so there's no reason this should have happened. His older brother is left perplexed, and is starting to believe, just maybe, the Mothman really did have something to do with it. Heading west outside of Richmond, Virginia, a 17-year-old girl was telepathically spoken to when she was visited by the Mothman in the middle of the night. Horrified and paralyzed, she was told that she would be welcomed in hell when she got into a fatal car accident 2 nights later. It turns out that her and her best friend had plans to go on a mini road trip south to Norfolk to visit some boys they had been talking to. Well, it turns out she actually didn't go on the trip, too afraid by her experience. Her friend ended up getting in a fatal car accident that same night, exactly like this demonic being had telepathically told her. That was over 10 years ago, and she firmly stands that it was indeed the Mothman that visited her and told her, and gave her this insight. She is now a medium and training to be a psychic. And finally, the last sighting I'll share with you today is from a gentleman who swears he saw the Mothman dive in from the sky, down deep into Lake Ontario. He was currently visiting his family in Oswego, which is on the north border of New York State. His family owns waterfront property, in which you have pretty clear view of the lake. He said they were looking out one morning, and they saw this long bat figure, totally black, fly directly down, right into the water and disappear, maybe no more than 100 yards out, completely visible in the daytime. Anybody else around probably saw it too. It terrified him, and believes too that it was indeed the Mothman, after having so many sightings of him and his friends throughout his life. Turns out, he actually came from around the Point Pleasant area himself, so he knew well what he was seeing. Perhaps this thing follows people around. Perhaps it was just a freak sighting. I guess we'll never know. Again, thank you for taking the time to read these to your audience, to make people more aware. If I could help inform and educate at least one person, it makes my job easier. We'll be in touch. I got tons more amazing stories for you, of all different varying cryptids. Take care. I used to be a trucker way back in the day, and I've had all sorts of weird encounters and experiences, especially at truck stops. Those are not places you want to be late at night. But anyway, what I'm here to tell you about is something that I simply cannot explain, and there's no writing it off as something I dreamt or made up or had a vision of. This was a real flesh and blood creature. Let me explain. I was currently en route, and actually around the Point Pleasant area in Virginia, when I felt a heavy thud on the back of my cargo trailer. I decided to pull over, since it felt like there was some added weight. After pulling over, I got out of my truck, and as soon as I got out and looked up at the top of the trailer, I was horrified by what I saw. Standing there, on top of my cargo trailer, was what I would describe to you, or what I know now as the Mothman. The first thing I saw were these two giant red glowing orbs. I nearly fell back onto my butt when I saw this. Then, I saw the shape surrounding it, and just how large it was. In fact, I probably saw the wings first, before I did the rest of the body. It was getting dusk out, so it was pretty dark, and there wasn't a whole lot of light. So that's why I saw the eyes first, more than the body. But as soon as I saw this thing, it didn't take me more than 5 seconds before I saw all I wanted to, and I ran back in my truck, and I floored it out of there. I guess this thing must have took off, because as I'm pulling out into the road, not only did I do it recklessly and dangerously, not even flipping on my blinker, this thing must have flew off. But when I got out to look at it, it looked right at me. Now, at the time, I had no idea there was such a thing called the Mothman, and if you had told me about it then, I would have laughed at you, telling you that you're making up fake horror stories. Well, I was quickly proved wrong. After telling some of my friends about it, they told me that that area, Point Pleasant, is actually a hotbed for Mothman sightings. And you guessed it, I just happened to be a lucky individual to have my own very sighting of this supposed thing. The thing is, I don't consider myself lucky one bit. It was terrifying. It was almost a traumatic experience. Maybe not going that far, but I have no desire to run into this thing again, nor do I want to see it. After spending some time online and reading some encounters and sightings, there's actually a plethora of sightings of this same creature floating all around the internet. And well, I haven't taken the time to write mine down and submit it to all these websites. I thought I could start by sending in mine to yours, and hopefully, if I'm lucky, you'll read it, because maybe somebody else who has had their own encounter with something entirely different, or maybe the same creature, will hear this and understand that they are not crazy or alone. You gotta understand that when you see something like this, that it is so far out of the realm of normal that you begin to suspect you're losing it, that you're going crazy, and that you're not right in the head. I thought that for quite some time afterwards, until I was finally brave enough, or maybe the feeling bothered me enough that I had to tell somebody about what happened. Anyway, I'm not going to drag this on forever. You don't need to tell me twice the Mothman is out there, and I'm going to do everything I can to avoid ever going back there. Luckily, I don't have that same job anymore, so I have no reason to go back there. Count me lucky, I guess. Back in 1972, my grandfather recounts to me that at the time, he was working as a car salesman and even was working on starting his own car business. That was until my grandfather's business fell into total financial ruin and my grandmother passed away shortly after. But something happened that he can't quite explain, that he believes was a demon an omen that visited him, and possibly projected evil onto his life. At the time, my grandmother and grandfather lived far on the outskirts in Chicago. They actually lived in a much more rural area. I believe it was north, but it might be east. I could be wrong. Either way, one night my grandfather was driving home, and he said that he was stopped in the middle of the road by this demon with 2 wings and large glowing red eyes. Keep in mind that at the time, he had never heard of the Mothman or heard of such a thing. Since it was only 1972, media outlets didn't really have a great way of going global yet or across the US. If you didn't have the newspaper, well, you didn't really know anything unless it was word of mouth. My grandfather swears this is true, that this evil being flew down to the middle of the road and spoke telepathically to my grandfather. My grandfather actually never fully told me what this thing told him telepathically, but from what happened afterwards, he said it touched his life in the worst way. 3 months after this encounter, his wife, my grandmother, came down with stage 4 cancer and passed away just a few months later. During that time, his business also seemed to go sour, having to file complete bankruptcy and leading to financial ruin. My grandfather turned to alcoholism for 12 years before finally joining AA and turning his life around. Today, my grandfather is alive, healthy, old as can be, and he eventually remarried. But he still can't refute that is one of the scariest things that has ever happened to him, and he believes that it is a supernatural omen that came to destroy his life, or so he believes. Personally, I'm not really sure what to think about it, although it is rather convincing, because my grandfather is not a storyteller. It's just weird how this thing appeared out of nowhere and projected its own negativity onto his life. And to this day, my grandfather firmly believes that whatever this thing was, which he now knows as a Mothman, or was the Mothman, is the one that caused his wife to die and his business to nosedive into financial ruin. The only thing I can really make out of my grandfather's story is that I do know that some people believe the Mothman is actually a bad omen and only appears when a catastrophe is about to happen. It would make sense, since its first appearance was right before the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967, only about 6 or 7 years prior to my grandfather's encounter. And then, shortly after appearing to my grandfather, his wife dying and his business going sour. How else would you describe that? What could it have possibly been? Is it possible that the Mothman is actually a demon? I used to live in Point Pleasant about 9 years ago for about 1.5 years because I worked a job down there, in which case I ended up moving because I got married. I'll spare you an incredibly long and boring backstory and just cut right to the chase. During my time there, even though I was only there 1.5 years, I quickly made a lot of friends and grew to be a small part of the community, knowing and getting to talk a lot of people. You wouldn't believe the number of sightings that I had heard firsthand. It was enough to make a believer out of me, some of whom were very credible witnesses, like previous sheriff deputies or first responders, and they each had their own harrowing stories. Sadly, I come to you with no encounters of my own, but I can tell you from all the eyewitness stories that I had heard, it's pretty terrifying what's going on down there. Apparently, this cryptid, I guess you call it, is running rampant. Sometimes people seeing it chasing them and attacking their car. Other times, people will see it flying around in the sky. Another man who had seen it jumping from tree to tree on his way on a lone road. When I first moved down there, I had actually never heard of the local legend myself, until I quickly befriended many people in the community, and that's when it became more and more out. I was even warned about certain places around town you shouldn't go after dark. Yeah, it got that crazy, but I didn't really pay any attention. I was kind of a loner anyway, as far as going around town. I kept to myself for the most part. I didn't really explore a whole lot. I kind of just stayed home, went to a couple friends' houses here and there, was a small part of the community for some time. but I didn't really go all over the town, if that makes sense. Like I said though, the most credible and real witnesses to me were the previous employees of the sheriff's department and first responders. Their accounts were harrowing and terrifying to listen to, many of them having their very own first-hand accounts themselves, and even the deputies, or previous deputies. Man, their stories were more than enough to send chills down my spine. If you haven't really heard of the Mothman, or haven't gotten a chance to explore the Mothman, I encourage you to start Googling and looking up sightings and encounters. I promise it won't disappoint you. After being down there and being enriched in that culture and hearing all the sightings and encounters, it just proved to me right then and there that maybe monsters really do exist. The Mothman is one of those things that happens to just divide people into two different camps. Those that think it's dumb, and those that think it's an intelligent and sentient being, and has its own motives. I lean towards the second. I only saw the Mothman once, ever, and the encounter not only came to define my life ever after, but it remains my earliest and most vivid childhood memory. I was 7 years old, and my parents had a home in the suburbs of Chicago. I know what you're thinking when you hear Chicago. Skyscrapers and carbon dioxide. But where we lived, it was as country as a turnip green, and pretty quiet. Monsters were the last thing on my mind, at least not other than the ones that we heard about in the news that came from the cities. I was out having fun in a cluster of trees one day. I could tell that the sun would set soon, and I was beginning to head home, when I became aware of a sort of strange buzzing sound. I couldn't tell you if it was something that I heard, or if it was something that I actually felt. I just remember the sensation in my ears and on my skin at the same time, like a bad setting on a massage bed. The sensation was distracting, and I missed the shape that leapt overhead from the branches of one tree to another. Just as I was starting to get enough sense in me to persist in moving towards home, the shape came down from the trees and landed directly in my path. The new proximity of the presence made the buzzing so intense, it was just a few steps away from being agony. The figure that stood before me was a little more than a shadow in the evening light, and yet it seemed like it would appear to be a shadow even at high noon, as light seemed to be absorbed and refracted by the being, rather than reflected by it. It was horrifying. The only part of it that didn't swallow light was its horrible eyes, which were two bulging spheres of unnerving red light. Their glow guttered slightly, with a cold fire of bioluminescence. As soon as I was looking into those eyes, I couldn't look away. The buzzing began dialing into my thoughts, with a language that I didn't speak and that I couldn't understand. Whatever this thing was, I didn't know it was Mothman at the time. It was trying to speak to me telepathically, in some sort of demonic language. I could only observe how my mind was reacting to it. I couldn't tell if it was psychic or something more. 3 times the buzzing sensation ramped up to an unbearable intensity, like I was being punched or whipped or slapped from the inside out. On the 3rd stroke, my vision went blurry, and I passed out. I woke up in my bed, and the memories were distant enough to make me question if I had dreamed the whole thing. When my parents entered my bedroom to check on me, the looks on their faces told me that I had dreamed none of it. Like any 7-year-old would, I told my story of the horrific monster that I witnessed, as if I were relating something perfectly matter of fact, and I described the things that it did to me as best as afforded by my limited 7-year-old vocabulary. Nobody believed me. I mean, how could they? Asking anyone to believe in a 9-foot entity resembling a demonic moth that went around giving children migraines was a high price. Asking for an additional leap of faith in that notion that said demonic moth was now outside of its native home, it wasn't until later in life that I could tell that my encounter with the Mothman wasn't just a benign crossing of paths. Rather, it had seeded something inside of me. I became intimately acquainted with anxiety and dread. Right before something awful would happen in my world, I would feel that buzzing sensation. Sometimes it would be subtle, as a tingling in my fingertips. Other times it was unbearable, as if one of my limbs had been asleep for hours. Or it would be deafening, keeping me from sleep. But without fail, whenever the sensation came, trouble accompanied it. I'm in my 30s now, and over the years, I've done my research on this thing. It itself has built a reputation as being a harbinger of doom, like a bad omen appearing before disaster, much the same way of its appearance back in the 1960s and the great collapse of the bridge. Don't think it's a curse that I could hammer out into a blessing. My experience with the Mothman might be a little different than anything else you've read, but it still holds a common thread with the other accounts for one simple fact. Nothing, literally nothing, has ever occurred in connection with the Mothman that has ever been good. My experience with the Mothman isn't all that big, and yet somehow it is. I'll tell you, and you decide what to think. I'm from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the supposed nest of the beast, I guess. I was in college at the time. Me and my buddies had made it in all together, so it was only a matter of time before we got in trouble. My friend Jack had met a girl that he really liked, and all of her friends were boy-hungry and were eager to pair off with the rest of us. Looking back, it's questionable if they even really liked us. But when you're a college brat, you don't always need a reason to do things, especially things that involve the opposite sex. All we knew was that we were together, and each of us had a girl that we thought we could call our own, and we had access to some pretty decent alcohol and no adult supervision. Add that to the ingredient of there being woods nearby in any direction, and you went viola, the perfect recipe for a good time. Or so I thought. The girl I had paired off with for the reason of college was your stereotypical flowsy blonde, and for the sake of the story, we'll call her Cheryl. We sat around the campfire. Before long, we kind of weren't talking to each other anymore, but pawing at our dates. Me and her got the notion to go play hide and seek in the deep dark woods. So, we stumbled over the bodies of some of our lightweights in our group and went off into the pines. I couldn't see her, but I could hear her. She was giggling uncontrollably, and at the time, it was the cutest thing in the world. I don't really know at what point I stopped hearing her giggle, but I could still hear her movement all around me. I figured my senses must have been royally blunted because she suddenly had this incredible speed. When I was closing in on her in one direction, it seemed like she would disappear and reappear behind me. And then, when I would turn around, the sound of her feet were somewhere else. I finally yelled out that it was time to stop screwing around. A voice answered me, but it wasn't Cheryl's. It automatically dialed my dread knob up to 100, despite my intoxication. Imagine hearing that sound while you're all alone in the dark, when you thought you were alone with your girlfriend, and you suddenly realize she's not there. Well, that's how I felt. The sound had made me stand still for a moment, but then, my eyes had more or less adjusted to the dark. I didn't exactly have the help of a lot of moonlight, but I could pick out the shapes of the trees. And then a towering figure tiptoed from behind one tree and crossed my view to disappear behind another tree. It did it exactly the way that I expected Cheryl would have, except that this was coming from something so tall and so inhumanly grotesque in shape, with two demonic wings folded up behind it, with long behemoth arms held out at its sides, and two red eyes staring directly at me, into me. This was a living demon. It stopped to observe me, like a frightened insect up from the trees. I took off running as fast as I could, back to the safety of the fire. The good news is, is that I found Cheryl next to the campfire. She had lost me about the same time I had lost her, so she just found her way back and passed out. Well, fast forward in time, and things got a lot worse. She passed away not long after this sighting, with what I would learn to be was the Mothman. She was found in her dorm, unconscious. She hadn't shown up for class in several days, and her friends went to check up on her. She was rushed to the hospital, only to be pronounced dead. She had overdosed on heroin. I don't know if that's one of the disasters that Mothman's appearance supposedly predicts, but did occur after my own personal encounters with this monster. I'll never know, and it's all the same if I never find out. I believe I have a strange incident worth mentioning that involves the Mothman, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll leave it up to you to put those pieces together. See, my knowledge of the Mothman is very minimal, but I do know that there was something involving a town called Point Pleasant, in which the Mothman appeared on a bridge, and then after, it was cited that the bridge collapsed, or something along those lines. Listen, I've barely done much research, but enough to know that what is basically described is the gist of what happened. The way I would describe it is this being is called to be a bad omen. That relates to the incident that I'm about to tell you about, because it's the only thing that leads me back to believing that this is the same being that I saw. A couple of years back in the wintertime, I was visiting my brother, who didn't live far away from me, and he had become very ill. The doctors were not able to figure out what exactly was wrong with him, and his illness had taken him to such a depth that I had to start taking time off work to seriously help him out. He wasn't married and didn't have any kids, so him and I were really all each other had. Mom and Dad had passed away long ago, and we were still very close. His illness continued to get worse and worse, and he would have random bouts of night terrors, extreme vomiting, deliria, sometimes totally forgetting who he was and where he was at. He would fall unconscious at random times, appearing to have seizures. Blood tests, CT scans, you name it. Every test under the sun doctors ran on him, but nothing would come back conclusive. It was truly baffling. Doctors and nurses could not find anything wrong with him. He even tested for cancer, but came back negative on multiple occasions. Then, he went through a period where he seemed to be surprisingly getting much better, much faster than he was deteriorating. He was regaining his energy and strength like never before, and for the first time in a long while, I was able to be independent. I had visited him a couple times during this, and while he was regaining his strength back, it was at this point as I was leaving the house one evening that I saw what looked to be a tall black bat-like figure perched up on top of his chimney, staring down at me with bright red eyes. I don't know what I was looking at, or if I was having an hallucination or what, but I got out of my truck and I shook my fist at it and told it to get away from my brother. I thought it was a demon, but little would I know that it was truly coming for his life. I screamed at it, I cussed at it, I called it everything under the sun, and it just sat there, looking at me, and then in a flash of light, flew off. I've never felt so angry before. I understand you might consider my reaction crazy, because most people would not have reacted that way. Most people would have been terrified to see what I did. But the overwhelming feeling of this thing coming to prey on my weakest, sickly brother made me sick, even if his condition was drastically improving at the moment. Let me explain. I'm very overprotective over my brother, and always have been. I would find myself in bouts of bravery, even at times where normal people should have been terrified over the course of growing up. That involves high school bullies and other abusive situations between my father, him, and I. He's my flesh and blood, and I'll always love him, even if he is gone and in a better place. I would later on research and find out what it was that was on his chimney, and everything seemed to point to the whole Mothman phenomenon, which I had nothing on or any knowledge about. I do remember reading something about the whole Point Pleasant Bridge and it crashing, and just a bunch of other sightings of people have had in the time being. I think I've mainly brushed it off the time and tried not to think too much about it. I didn't care if I saw a supernatural being or not. I wasn't going to let it do anything to my brother, because honestly, that's the feeling I got from it. As soon as I looked into its eyes, into infinity, I couldn't shake the feeling like it was the Grim Reaper coming for my brother's soul. A few days go by, and I get a call from one of his close friends who's at his house, telling me that his condition has suddenly decreased and he needed to be transported to the hospital ASAP. Of course, I raced over there, doing all I could to take care of my brother, and we called an ambulance. He was taken to the hospital, where he had received great care, but his conditioning kept worsening. About 2 days later, he passed away in the hospital. Even his cause of death was unknown, and the doctors marked it as a natural cause. They conducted an autopsy, but reported nothing abnormal. His death was the hardest thing to ever have happened to me in my life, and I'm still not fully recovered from it. I don't think I ever will. You just don't recover from something like that. The meaning behind me telling you this isn't about the fact that I lost my brother. It's the fact that I want to know what I saw, and if it had anything to do with his sudden passing. You look at the Point Pleasant situation, and it appearing there was like an omen. Is this one of those superstitious situations where if you see the Mothman, something bad is going to happen? That's what I begin to question, and my sanity has soon slipped away. I'm not sure about anything anymore, and no research I can find is truly concrete. I'm just asking you for answers, since you seem to know a lot about this kind of stuff and the paranormal. The only thoughts I can honestly confide in is that my brother is now in a more peaceful state. I don't know what mystery illness he had, or why he died when he did, even though he seemed to be getting better. But he's gone now, and I'm still fighting day after day to accept it. The best thing I could do at this point is to get answers as to what and why. Believe me, I know if I see the Mothman again, he's probably going to be coming back for me, and he ain't going to win so easily. I won't let him. You might think I'm crazy, but I swear on what I say is truth. I do believe that I've been seeing this creature, what many call the Mothman, flying around at night around where I live. To make matters worse, many of my family has seen it too, and they all have their own stories. Of course, everybody's story and situation is different, but mine feels a little more terrifying. I've only ever seen it at night, and it only ever reveals itself by sitting on top of a tree or somewhere on top of my house, waiting for me to exit so it can terrify me. I've shot at it multiple times, but to no avail. Bullets don't even seem to bother this thing, and it never makes a sound. Even as it flies through the air or flaps its wings, nothing. Not even the air around it moving. It resembles that of a human with large wings, kind of like a bat. I've seen its face, and it looks more evil than some of the movies that I've seen on TV. I know deep down in my heart that this thing comes from the pits of hell, and I've done every ritual, every ward, every prayer to try and get rid of it, and nothing works. I don't know why it's stalking me and my family, but it seems intent on getting something that it wants. I just don't know what that is yet. It doesn't appear every night, but it shows itself often just to let me know that it's there. At night sometimes, I'll hear it walking around on my roof, and then it suddenly disappears, just as soon as it appeared. I can't even step outside at night for a cigarette without feeling this stifling thick feeling of something wrong. It's so thick in the air, you can cut it with a knife. I'll always know he's around because of the bitter feeling in my stomach, the uneasiness he gives off. It makes your hair stand up. Nothing can compare to the fear this thing emits. It doesn't attack though, nor has it ever tried to. That's the scariest part. It just waits and watches, as if it's waiting for something. Waiting for the right time to strike, or the right moment to act. It's calculating, its movements, it's strategizing. The way it watches me, watches my family. It's unnerving, and I know it's planning and plotting something. I've gone to pastors, I've gone to healers, I've gone to psychics. Nobody has a concrete answer as to what I'm dealing with. I burn sage and I place wards around my house, but it's like this being doesn't even seem to notice nor care. I fear I will never get rid of it till it finally gets what it wants. I live in the greater Chicago area, all the way out by myself. I'm far enough away from any neighbors that I'm more secluded, and I've even opened up the lines of dialogue between me and my neighbors and have asked them, regardless of them thinking I'm crazy, if they have had any similar experiences. Of course, none of them do, and don't know what I'm talking about. It either makes them a liar, or they are in denial. It makes me feel even worse, because I know whatever this is solely targeting me and my family. Listen, I don't know if you know anything about what I'm going through, but I'm desperate. Maybe it wants my soul. Maybe it wants me dead. I don't know. All I know is that this thing is on a mission, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. I just hope that what it wants isn't me, or any one of my family members.